Hello and welcome to the New Lines podcast. I'm Lydia Wilson, and this is a podcast where we delve into some of the biggest ideas, events, and personalities in the Middle East and beyond. Today, I'll be talking to award-winning investigative journalist Tam Hussein about his article for New Lines magazine entitled "The Facade of the Afghan Jihad." Tam, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. Really a privilege to be here.
In his article, Tam explains how the fall of Kabul last August resonated with Islamists in the West, reigniting old narratives and tropes about Afghanistan. Western supporters of jihadist groups, Tam says, are as guilty as any Bush-era neoconservative of flattening the complexities of Afghan politics into a simple, self-serving morality tale of good versus evil. Ever since the war against the Soviets, Afghanistan has been portrayed as a land of jihad. The apparent victory of the Mujahideen in the 1980s, just like the Taliban's victory today, promised a muscular, militarized Islam able to defend the faithful against the oppression and indignity experienced by so many Muslims in the West and across the world. Ignoring, of course, the oppression and indignity suffered by Afghans under the boot of these dubious heroes. As Tam explains, sympathetic communities passed around books and pamphlets and VHS videos spreading these propaganda narratives, combining them with anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about the New World Order. The proliferation of false narratives and fake news is not exclusive to the 21st century. In jihadist circles, this has been going on for decades, he writes. Tam, your article goes deep into the history of myth-making surrounding Afghanistan. But one of the things that makes it particularly interesting is that it's clearly not just an intellectual history, but one based on first-hand reporting. You've spent a big part of your career investigating jihadism, and that experience comes through in the essay. When did you first notice that Afghanistan and the Taliban were being mythologized in this way by Western sympathizers?
I mean, of course, when Kabul fell, you noticed on social media that they were being, they were being celebrated. But I mean, I think that we saw this very early at the turn of the millennium. We saw this. Mullah Omar were being celebrated, and this is of course during my student days, even before I was a journalist or any of these kind of things. This was just the spirit of the times. You noticed that people were looking at Mullah Omar as almost a savior figure. And it was a given almost that, you had to kind of back him and so on. So this is not something that, just came out of nowhere. This is a trend that had been going on for decades.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm sorry. Yeah, you're talking about pre 9/11 here.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so how do you see 9/11 changing that or emphasizing that? What happened around 9/11 narratives?
I think some of the people that I went to university with, I mean, it was a wake up call. And some of my friends that I went to uni with, they went to Afghanistan, and actually lost 2 people there, actually, as a result of this.
So this is really personal.
Absolutely, it's personal, and you realize, when you go on this. I mean, in fact, it's one of the reasons probably why I'm so interested in it. But and then you see this in Syria, the same thing almost. Some of the same stuff that we were going through our university years and seeing this stuff was going on in Syria. The only difference was the people that suffered were Syrians. And these guys were coming in saying, "I'm going to save the Syrians." Almost, they had this almost, I don't mean to, almost like a colonial mentality. We're going to school these Syrians about Islam. I'm like, man, we're doing the same. It's the same old. Sorry.
So when you say that we were seeing the same things with Syria, what kind of narratives were the same between the Afghan jihad and then the later Syrian conflict?
So what I saw in Syria was some of these guys were saying, look, he had been, and they would argue almost from authority. I'm going to take the lesson of such and such person because he had been to Afghanistan, or he's an Afghan veteran, and so on. He'd fought in these places. And Afghanistan always took on that legendary status. A lot of these guys were, had the Afghan dress, the pahul, and so on. And you're like, okay, do you know that probably these guys that were serving probably didn't even serve, fight in the anti-Soviet conflict, probably fought, took part in the civil war. And you see this a lot. A lot of people don't actually, a lot of these boys weren't aware of what transpired factually, historically. And in actual fact, that's one of the reasons I wanted to, I decided to write To the Mountains, because I wanted to really unpack and show that, look, things were far more, I wanted to just make the narrative more complex, because history is complex.
And what had happened is that history had been very flattened.
Absolutely.
And in order to produce these kind of heroes, and as you say, legends. And what comes across extremely clearly in your essay is the romanticization of jihad. For example, you described the stories about martyrs who begin smelling of perfume when they're killed, or there were flocks of birds helping in a particular fight and aiding the mujahideen to victory. And you also give a very good example of this being taken up in the West by Cat Stevens or Yusuf Islam in his song Afghanistan, Land of Jihad. So do you still see this aspect of jihad, the romantic aspect, as important in the way that Afghanistan is still talked about in the West?
I mean, I think in many ways, the Muslim world, they were reeling from so many issues that Afghanistan almost became, you willed it to be the land of jihad. Now, that's not to denigrate, of course, the sacrifice of what Afghans did, but I think where the Muslim world were at the time, Afghanistan became something more. I think a lot of people gave much more meaning to that country than it was. Just like if you look at Syria now, a lot of people give that a sacral meaning because of, what, let's say, they need. Remember also that Syria is, if you look at, for example, a lot of the traditions, you have prophetic traditions mentioning Syria and so on. So it has a sacral element to it, and it elevates it. And you find that with Afghanistan sometimes. I should say though that if you read, for example, Charlie's War, it's not just Muslims that felt were awed by these Afghans fighting the Russians. It was also, of course, the Americans. There is an account about Muhammad the Conqueror taking down 2 Hind choppers and 20 Spetsnaz men with the Doshka, and Casey would keep that and play that to himself and really be boosted by the achievements of just one mujahid. So these legends, I think it kind of spread not just within the Muslim world, it also spread onto Western culture in general.
Well, I think we can probably see that as part of a very long history of glorifying war.
100%, yeah.
We kind of need these heroes, don't we? And we need to fit it into a narrative of good and bad, which lends itself very well to mythologizing.
Absolutely.
You talked in your essay about how these figures were mythologized themselves.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you're still seeing those same stories now with the recent news in Afghanistan.
Of course, you see. I mean, especially on the online forum, if you notice, there are some of the responses were because I had said that Abdullah Azam may have simplified things and so on. It was almost people just shut. Now I'm not going to read this article because he said Abdullah Azam did X, Y, and Z. But I mean, if you read, for example, Thomas Haghammer's book on him, the man, he's a complex historical figure, and he was a young man, and young men, tend to oversimplify things. When he was writing, he was in his 40s. early 40s. So my point is, of course, Bin Laden and Abdullah Azam is still mythologized, and we really need to treat them as historical figures.
Yes, yes,
I
and
think
not
I think that was the whole point about this article. I wanted to take it out of myth and make them into historical realities, because what happens if you don't is, I believe, whether that's Afghan Syrians, or if you look at, for example, the First World War, it was the ordinary soldier who went to his death for what? For what?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's very important to actually look at the reality of these things. I mean, another point that comes across in your essay is about the conspiracy theories that are being latched onto. Now, this has been going on, as you said, for decades. But one thing that was very curious was that they were adopting things like the New World Order. And for any listeners who aren't familiar with that particular conspiracy theory, it basically alleges that there's a cabal of secret communists, or let's say globalists, it's a very anti-Semitic based theory, are using the United Nations to create a totalitarian one world government. It emerged from the fringes of the American far right over the 70s and the 80s, but then gets adopted into jihadist propaganda. I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about how that idea crossed over and became absorbed into jihadist narratives.
So I'm going to tell you how we came across it as we were growing up. I think that's probably the best way. I mean, what you've told me, for example, about how those narratives exist in the 70s, 80s. Had I not read about it, I wouldn't have known about it. It's just like, I just remember these were tapes being sold outside, mosques on a Friday.
Right.
And sometimes, for example, I remember there was a shop on Baker Street that would have these VHS videos, and you would go in and you could just say, oh, I want to listen to him, and you want to listen to him, and so on. So it wasn't, this was in the day of tapes, and you could listen to these, and they were freely available, and it was not seen as anything, but actually, no, it was very, there was no, as if it was true almost, and
So
that's how
what?
it traveled. That's how it traveled into, you know. Is in a way, I mean, when you look at Sheikh Hamza Yusuf's New World Order, the talk there, it's maybe he talks in a very intellectual way, but some of these ideas had trickled in, and it's still there now, isn't it? Even more
It's
seriously.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, it's all over the internet now, I'd say. But tell me a bit more about the ideas. What were you absorbing through these VHSs and the cassettes that you could
So
buy anywhere?
for instance, what you would have, of course, the New World Order. You would have from In the Shadows. In the Shadows was, I mean, if it's worth, because it's still on the YouTube, and you can listen to the comments just below, the impact that In the Shadows had. It was reversing tunes, back playing Madonna's songs and showing you, look, here is when you play it in this way, you can hear evil messages and subliminal messages and all of these kind of things, which sounds silly now, but at the time it was like, wow, my eyes have been opened. And in fact, there
Right,
was a comment on YouTube saying, you know what, I heard this 20 years ago and my eyes are now open. um
right.
and this was not, I don't mean to, it's easy to laugh, but actually this was the sense. This was a time where a lot of these things, were widely available and accepted. I remember being given a book. I mean, I graduated from history, on 1066,
Right.
of course, when William Hastings uh, invaded, but it actually had something to do with the Freemasons.
Right.
And I'm like, okay, this is balmy, but this was something that was being sold.
But it's
Yeah,
not just then, is it? These conspiracies are alive and well now, maybe not exactly the same ones.
but
But
they build on something, right?
right.
You
And
know,
there's a very clear continuity, I would say.
exactly.
And that particular conspiracy, the New World Order, that wasn't the end of the crossover with the far right, or the alt right, as we've come to call it. And I've just read a recent report from the Institute of Strategic Dialogue, which detailed how Gen Z Islamists online are borrowing all sorts of language and imagery and themes and conspiracy theories from the alt-right. They've named this interconnected ecosystem of young internet-savvy Salafi influences Islamogram. Now, the report describes the Taliban's capture of Kabul as a particularly clear example of this convergence between the alt-right and this, Gen Z Salafist subculture. Can you say anything about how this Islamogram reacted to the Taliban victory and what makes it so illustrative of this crossover with the alt-right?
So what was very interesting was it was almost the reason the Taliban won was because they had kept to their values. They were far more masculine. They hadn't abandoned their manhood and so on and so forth. So you could see, because I remember finding videos where prominent far right activists or alt right activists had basically said, I respect the Taliban. And then they explained the reasons why, and you realize, okay, it's almost a reaction towards a certain current within the left. Probably a certain current within the left. And you saw why the Taliban made sense to them, because it's almost like it's pure masculinity and religion and all of these things reasserting itself like it used to be.
Right.
Like it used to be. And you see, when you're like this is what happens.
Right. So there's nostalgia.
Nostalgia, exactly.
There's a sense that there's this time in the past when you, however you is described, was strong. And the unifying feature that I see across the alt-right and the Islamist discussions are, of course, bound up in a very toxic masculinity and misogyny. So we also includes men, this time when men were strong. And of course, that's most easily seen in times of war.
Exactly, yeah.
And so
Absolutely.
I saw that being very much celebrated. And also the kind of nationalism, this kind of hyper-authoritarianism and nationalism that, we could call fascism, right? And Trump really exemplified this type of leader. And I think there was a certain longing for that strength of nation.
Yeah, I could use the word, that it's longing, isn't it? Whether the Taliban, let's say, embodies any of these things, it's almost irrelevant. It's what you want to see in their representation.
Yeah.
Remember, of course, Taliban, they've got different factions and so on and so forth. But if it's what you want to see in that,
Right.
isn't it?
Right.
And that's where you see the memes. I remember seeing a meme actually. It wasn't actually a far right meme. It was a meme whereby they were saying, so Britain and France were fighting over fish. Then it had a picture of, it was two dogs, two collies, I think they were fighting over fish. But then before they had them dressed up in kind of Napoleon and Nelson or something, fighting over empire. So this is where we've become, and this is where we are now almost. And you're like, okay, I could see that, and I've seen similar memes with the Taliban and the West.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, we saw a lot of those sorts of themes through Brexit, didn't we?
Exactly.
Harking back to a mythical, strong past. And again, a lot of oversimplification. You're saying, the Taliban isn't actually one thing, and that was glossed over and still is glossed over. Well, the same sort of thing happened with empire. It wasn't exactly seen as complicated. It was seen as glorious.
And I think one of the things that we need to do when we study, when we're covering the Taliban, is actually, I mean, you guys are lucky because we've got Fazil Qazizai at New Lines.
That's right.
Like it's about complexity. That it's just, as we report things, that it's the more complexity we can introduce, the less we allow for these narratives to form.
Yeah.
I think that, in my view, is the key. It doesn't, you're not putting necessarily a a value judgment, because these are things that happened in the past. But the more information, the more complexities we introduce, we kind of disrupt these narratives that form, I think, out of human need.
Yeah,
You
well,
know?
the question of what to do about it is, of course, really complicated. And that's partly that, as you say, it is a human need. And simplicity often satisfies that human need a lot more than complexity. It's quite hard taking a complex message to somebody who already thinks they have the right answer.
Yeah.
And then, of course, another massive difficulty in addressing a lot of these theories, whether they are from the far right or Islamists or just some anti-vaxxing conspiracist, is that they are somehow impervious to outside influence, because alternative messages are dismissed as part of the paranoid worldview. They can even feed the conspiracies. So, if you have a myth-busting type of communications campaign from the government, you're taking those myths, and the people who already believe in them will say, well, the government would say that.
Yeah, exactly.
So actually we're right, because the government are behaving exactly as we would expect them to behave.
You don't win, do you? Sometimes.
No.
That's really, really hard. I mean, I think personally, critical thinking, we really need to focus on that in school, and I think literature and these kind of things actually have a place as a result of it, because you're forced to read situations, forced to deal with situations that you've never been in before. So it's very, very difficult to not see the other side, whether that is, let's say, I don't know, if read Giovanni's Room or something like that. Hang on a second, I'm reading Baldwin. I thought he was X, Y, and Z. I thought these people were this way. And then I read Giovanni's Room, or you read something else of Baldwin, you realize, okay, it challenges your own notions or prejudices that you have,
Yeah. But then if we go back to what you said about an emotional need, is there any way that thinking can really challenge our emotions? And the second thing, of course, is that romanticization quite often is also impervious to rationality. If you believe that the dead body of a martyr is going to smell of perfume because of the blessing from God himself, that's not something I don't think critical theory can really touch.
No,
Would you
you're right.
agree?
Yeah, I agree. I think look, with some of these things, it's almost, I wanted to kind of say, okay, you want to have that, but you need to put that aside and think about kind of the consequences of some of these things. You want to have romantic views, okay, but just remember that the people that are going to pay the price almost it's not going to be you, because you're going to be sitting at home here, whereas it's going to be Afghans who are going to face that. And I actually felt I was really, really, not necessarily. I mean, I was quite upset in the sense that these people making judgments of these poor people trying to leave, and insinuating motives for why they wanted to leave. From Kabul airport.
Yeah.
There was that emotion, and on the other hand, it was like, okay, why do we think that Afghanistan is just Kabul airport when the news was being covered? So you were almost kind of stuck in between these two emotions. You're like, how do you come out of that? As a journalist, I felt that I needed to really just try to report as fairly as I could and complicate matters as much as I could, in a way, in order for people who read it realize, okay, if they leave thinking things aren't as simple as I see it, then I've succeeded.
Right. That does make sense. And also what you're talking about is the humanization.
Absolutely.
That's what we need. We need to know why those people were running away, or why people chose to stay, and all the rest of it. And then I think that might be as important, if not more, than critical thinking myself.
Yes, and also I think maybe this is an unpopular thing, but I believe that we should do that with anyone, especially as journalists. You also need to do the same thing with, if you're covering, let's say, the Taliban. You need to make sure that you do the same thing with these are human beings, that you see those aspects as well, because if you don't, then you do the opposite. When you dehumanize the Taliban, let's say, then it's very easy to drop bombs on the Taliban village, as it were, and
Yeah.
and just say that they're Taliban, and that's it, let's close that. And then that's another issue. You can't do that. The more color we put into it, at least from where we're sitting, or then we can be far more, we can make decisions that hopefully will save lives.
Yeah, absolutely. We don't want to fall into the good evil
Absolutely.
narrative either way.
But that, of course, doesn't mean that you can't hold, you don't necessarily, that doesn't, make them impervious to holding them to account. We
Oh
have our
yeah,
sensibilities when it comes down to, what we think about education and so on and so forth. We have these views. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't ask them and we shouldn't question them and so on. But
sure.
it's so important that we don't.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And so, I mean, to go back to this idea of a continuity from the 1990s and how this information was so available to you and your friends, and you were all part of an of course offline network, because this was pre-internet. And now we see the same sorts of tropes and conspiracy theories circulating even more online. But do you think there's still an offline component to all this? Are you seeing these ideas circulating amongst real world networks as well?
I think so. I think so, definitely.
How are you seeing this?
Because in the way people talk. So I remember I sat down with I mean, it was very clear that he was thinking about going over to Syria and so on.
Hmm.
Because he wouldn't listen to me. I just realized, okay, he doesn't trust mainstream media. He doesn't do this. He doesn't do that. So I said to him, when we sat down, I said to him, look, man, I've been to these places, and I had to kind of show him, look, okay, the tomato prices, it's true. These are things that they have regulated, but these are the things that they're doing X, Y, and Z that I've seen with my own eyes.
So
And
you,
then he
yeah,
took that on board. So where is he? These are things that he's hearing. It's not just on an online forum. It's a human. It's human contact that he's having. That's how I've seen it,
yeah,
experienced it. I should say though that when we were growing up in the 90s and the early noughties, this was, I wasn't necessarily unique in the current. This is just what it, if you were at university, and you're a Muslim kid, you're gonna go through this. I happened to go to Queen Mary's, which was quite known at the time for a lot of that sort of activity. That and UEL, University of East London. These two, they were known for that. But the difference was, I mean, I studied history. A lot of these guys, they were quite binary in their education. They came from technical subjects. So when I was given, let's say, a book on the caliphate, I flipped the book at the back. I think Rashad wrote that. Looked at the back, and where's the footnotes? Where's the
mm,
sources almost?
mm.
Whereas, they were giving you pamphlets on Saladin, which was like 30, 20 pages. I'm like, what is this? This is a joke.
So you were more questioning because of what you were
I
studying.
think again, I think liberal arts just gives you that. Like, okay,
Yeah.
how can you take this seriously? It gives you a certain sort of training. I'm like, I'm not gonna accept these things that you're telling my friends. And a lot of the ones that went over, they came from a technical background, and I think
So
that matters a lot.
I mean, so that is one massive change since then. I don't think these materials are circulating in the same way, but of course they're much more available in a way online. What
Yes,
what
they
do you
are.
see as the differences in how people are absorbing these messages, given that they're coming through very different media?
So some of this stuff, there are it's sound bites that I'm seeing, but they're the same old sound bites.
So
You
it's the
know,
same thing,
so
just dressed up differently.
absolutely. I mean, like these, yeah, they're presented different, but the sound bites are the same. I've heard the same sound bites. And in fact, for example, guys like um, Jihadi John, they were aware of, books that tapes that was available in the noughties and the early late 90s.
Oh, wow. So it's the same not just the same message, the same material is being consumed.
Like, for example, well, I did a Twitter thread, but like, for example, Heart of Green Birds, for example, was an epic tape almost in the 90s. You know, it was going around. It was very available, and it was available. It was
available again through ISIS channels. I think.
Still, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You can, you know, they share it and so on, and it's something that they listen to and they get inspired by. So it's not, you know, some of these messages that they're still listening to, and that's not, that's established. You know, there's recycled, because I don't think the messages, you know, for all the sophistication of, you know, the videography and production quality of, let's say, ISIS and so on, you know, many of these ideas, you know, I didn't see much of a difference in the 90s and now. I genuinely didn't, you know, and I'm not saying that because I want to pick on anyone specific. It's just like something that I'm not, you know, those ideas that they were doing, it's just, the issue is scale. Right. You know, scale has increased, but some of these ideas were there.
Well, they're very, very durable for all the reasons we've touched on. They satisfy an emotional need. And that just shows what a difficult task it is to shake some of these legends and ideals.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, Tam, thank you so much for taking the time to explain all of this.
I hope I succeeded. I'm not sure I did.
I think so.
I'm not sure I did.
Well, if you'd like to hear more, you can follow Tam on Twitter at Tam Hussein, and you can read his essay, The Facade of the Afghan Jihad, on our website, newlinesmag.com. This week's podcast was produced by Joshua Martin and hosted by me, Lydia Wilson. You can subscribe to the New Lines Magazine podcast on your favourite podcast app. And of course, you can find more of the best stories from the Middle East and beyond on our website, newlinesmag.com. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you all next week.